From mysterious, legendary figures and places that modern historians still have questions about, to strange artifacts that aren't explained, history has left us with plenty of mysteries that need to be solved. Number 10. The Edinburgh suburb of Gilmerton has existed since medieval times and was once its own village before being incorporated into Scotland's capital city. Those searching for mysteries and historical places will find plenty in Edinburgh, most of them well known. But fewer know about a baffling mystery tucked beneath the ground in this quiet suburb. Located 4 miles from the city center is an unassuming cottage on one of the main roads out of Edinburgh. The cottage hides the entrance to a secret network of caves and tunnels named Gilmerton Cove that has existed since at least the 1700s. The cove was carved out of sandstone beneath the streets of Gilmerton. It mostly consists of one large corridor over 40 feet in length, with several smaller rooms coming off of it. The hall has 2 entrances and smaller corridors that seem to lead off somewhere. Many of the rooms feature benches carved out of the stone, which all face a single table. Some tables have holes carved into them, appearing to be for bowls to be placed in. The first reports of the cove come from the early 1700s. At the time, the cottage was owned by George Patterson, a blacksmith. He claimed to have excavated the cove himself between 1719 and 1724 to serve as a workshop and a home for himself and his family. People doubted the purpose of the cove, but initially believed Patterson was the person responsible for it. Patterson had previously been charged with operating an illegal drinking den on the Sabbath, and it was believed this was the den. The theory that the Gilmerton Cove was a drinking den lasted until the late 1800s. This was when the assistant keeper of the National Museum of Antiquities of Scotland conducted a study in the cove. It was impossible to determine what the cove had originally been used for, but the tool marks on the walls indicated that it had been made long before Patterson's time, and would have taken much longer than 5 years for a single man to complete. The researcher put forward that this was originally a trial bore. Gilmerton originally had been a mining village. In the 1500s, coal was the main product, but later limestone would also be quarried here. It was suggested that miners had dug the cove to search for coal and other minerals. When they found nothing, it was abandoned. It's possible that Patterson or someone else had rediscovered the trial bore and cleaned things up to make a drinking space. Later, researchers believed the cove had nothing to do with Gilmerton's mining past, and searched for another explanation. There have been a few theories. In recent years, surveys using ground-penetrating radar have found that the tunnel system could be up to twice as large as what it's currently mapped out. Some of the corridors are blocked with rubble, and it's possible one of these might contain clues to the real explanation. Some have speculated that the tunnels might lead to the Craigmillar Castle, 1.5 miles away, or towards Rosslyn Chapel, which lay over 3 miles away. There was a theory that this might have been used by the Knights Templar in some way as well. Others believed that it might have been used by the Hellfire Club, a mysterious organization that conducted ceremonies to mock religions. Another theory suggested that it might have been used by members of the Presbyterian Church of Scotland. The church was disallowed by King James VI and I, who ruled Scotland between 1567 and 1625. After this ruling, many Presbyterians met in secret, and the cove may have been the perfect place for that. Unfortunately, archaeologists found that the frequent usage over hundreds of years meant that there was little hope of uncovering the original purpose of the cove. If Patterson had used it as an illegal drinking den, he may have accidentally destroyed evidence that could have pointed to the Presbyterians, or something even older. It's possible that many of these different theories are correct, and further exploration of the coves could uncover the truth. Number 9. For centuries, historians believed the legendary city of Troy was nothing more than a myth. But in 1863, the ruins of this ancient city were uncovered, proving that there was some truth to the historical legend. Some historians and scholars hope the same might be true about the legendary Viking stronghold, Yams Borg. Most of what we know about Yams Borg comes from ancient sagas written in the 13th century, after the stronghold had been destroyed. There are some elements of fantasy intertwined in the sagas, making it hard to separate fact from fiction. But medieval scholar Adam of Bremen also wrote about the fort, implying that the legends may have been based on a real place. According to the legends, Yams Borg was a fortress surrounded by impenetrable walls built somewhere on the southern Baltic coast. This was the home of the Yams Vikings, an elite warrior class that would sometimes be used by the Danish king and sometimes fight against him. Entrance to the stronghold wasn't permitted to just anybody. Only men between the ages of 18 and 50 were allowed, and they had to fit in with the rest of the elite warriors there. They were encouraged to think of one another as brothers and to avenge a fallen Yams Viking where possible. Women were not permitted entry, and Yams Vikings were not permitted to stay away from the fort for more than 3 nights without specific permission. The sagas, especially the saga of the Yams Vikings, told epic stories about the warriors. The fortress was supposedly guarded by a giant named Mimir, who shared his name with a figure in Norse mythology, known for his knowledge and wisdom. Another story in the saga describes one of the men being turned into a dragon due to his greed. Away from the more mythological elements, these appeared to be a class of warriors who would have been terrifying to face. The mystery of whether Yams Borg is real, and if so, where it lies, has puzzled scholars for centuries. If it did exist, it was built in the 960s during the reign of the famous Viking king Harald Bluetooth. One saga claims that it was built by a Viking who fled Denmark to get away from Bluetooth, but most agree that it was built by Bluetooth himself, likely as a simple military outpost. The name Yams Borg simply means Yam Fortress, with Yam being the name that the Vikings gave to this area. Adam of Bremen and medieval German historians didn't use the name Yam, but a variety of similar names which modern historians believe all referred to what the Vikings called Yam. The precise location wasn't specified in the sagas, only that it was in the southern Baltic coast, in what is today Germany or Poland. Adam of Bremen described Yams Borg as being at the Oder estuary, a location which would line up with the island of Wollin. There have been many archaeological excavations on Wollin, as well as other sites on the coast. A few settlements and trading towns have been found, but nothing to say for certain that this is the legendary city. Some historians believe that there is further evidence Wollin was the home of this stronghold. At one ancient settlement here, there is evidence of a small Viking elite which was mostly male, but with an otherwise Slavic population. There was also evidence of a fortified wall and charcoal, which seemed to indicate the settlement had been destroyed by fire. According to the sagas, Yams Borg was destroyed by Magnus the Good in 1043. Magnus allegedly besieged the fortress and razed it to the ground. Further archaeological work could prove once and for all if this legendary stronghold was real, but for now it remains a mystery. Number 8. Between late 1896 and early 1987, citizens across the United States were craning their necks to look up at the sky in search of something that could not be explained. Newspapers around the country reported eyewitness accounts of the mysterious airships. Some were too fantastical to be real, but others seemed to be possible. Something was seen, and historians aren't certain what it was. The sightings began in Sacramento in late November of 1896. A local newspaper reported that witnesses who'd been outside at about 1 in the morning reported something unexplained. Some only saw a bright light, while others described a cigar-shaped flying object and apparently heard human voices coming from it. After the first sighting, people from multiple other Californian cities came forward. They all had relatively similar descriptions of the airship, which was traveling at high speeds. An attorney named George Collins then came forward claiming to represent the inventor of the airship. He said the inventor had come from Maine so as to keep his invention away from competitors there. He wanted to perfect his ship and was testing at night to remain as secretive as possible. Collins gave more interviews where he claimed to have witnessed it being tested and included more details about the machinery. He claimed that the inventor hadn't patented it yet, but his application was at the patent office. It wasn't long before people began to ridicule Collins and others who claimed to have seen the mysterious airship. Even though there was no evidence it was a hoax, it was too unbelievable for many, and it was assumed not to be true. At this point, heavier-than-air flight was still something confined to the science fiction novels. Hot air balloons and airships did exist, but they couldn't reach anywhere near the same speeds as the mysterious airship and didn't have the same handling abilities. But there was a lot of hope that something like the mysterious airship would be invented in the near future. Balloon-powered crafts appeared in science fiction and adventure novels, like Jules Verne's A Voyage in a Balloon and around the world in 80 days. There was a lot of media surrounding this invention that many believed would be coming soon. They were primed to believe that some extraordinary inventor would be testing out this kind of machine in secret, and they'd witnessed it. After the initial flurry of reports, the mysterious airship seemed to disappear. But in March of 1897, it was spotted again in Omaha. The ship appeared to be making its way across the country and was later spotted in Oklahoma and Texas. There were then sightings further north around Michigan, Iowa, and Washington state. Some have speculated there might have been at least 2 different ships, with one heading north and the other staying in the south. Descriptions did vary slightly. Some witnessed a ship that resembled a modern-day blimp, while others described canvas wings and propellers. An interesting description appeared in the Dallas Morning News, allegedly coming from a credible witness. He said, quote, "It floated about a half-mile above the earth and seemed to be about 50 feet long, or a cigar shape, with 2 great mugs thrust out from each side, a broad tail, or steering sail behind, and a long beak or blade resembling a cut water on a ship in front." He added that there was a searchlight at the front of the ship that was brighter than the moon, and a row of windows along the side. He saw no smoke or a smokestack and assumed it was powered by stored electricity. The description has some resemblance to modern UFO sightings, especially with the row of windows at the side of the craft. A battery-powered airship wasn't too fantastical at the time. Such crafts were being tested in Europe, but battery life meant they were extremely limited both in terms of speed and duration. Some sightings were later proven to be hoaxes. In one instance, students hung lanterns from a flagstaff to fool witnesses. In another, it was found that the airship was just a children's toy, but others have no such explanation. It's possible this was a case of mass hysteria, triggered by the initial hoaxes. People wanted to believe that the future technology was real, so they saw it. It might have also been the misinterpretation of a typical aerial phenomenon. More than a century on from these sightings, it's unlikely we will ever know for certain just what was seen. Number 7. Archaeologists excavating a site in eastern Germany came across an unusual and mysterious find in 2023. Finding the remains of 2 people side by side wasn't that strange, but the fact that one of them was missing a face was much more surprising. The dig site was a small village in Saxony-Anhalt. The excavation had already uncovered the remnants of an ancient castle and fortifications, as well as an imperial palace. It's believed the settlement would have been home to around 1,000 people and reached its peak between 750 and 1024 CE. There was evidence that some of the people who lived here were relatively wealthy, though whether they had any connection to the Holy Roman Emperors is uncertain. As well as the remnants of buildings, archaeologists found a cemetery with the remains of around 70 people. Of those, only one stood out as unusual. The plot contained 2 skeletons, which were believed to be male and female. The woman was about 5 feet tall, and the man was a few inches taller. It's believed they were husband and wife, as this kind of burial practice wasn't uncommon. They were buried sometime around 1000 CE. The man's burial included grave goods, including an iron blade and a belt set. He also had a fitting for an object called a staff of office, and it's believed he was some kind of high-ranking official. Historians believe it was unlikely that he was a warrior of some kind. If the man was as wealthy as his grave goods suggested, the fact that his wife had none was especially unusual. One possibility is that the woman was a Christian convert, while her husband might have still followed some older belief system. Even though the land might have been part of the Holy Roman Empire by this point, Christianity was still a relatively new religion for the region. Christianity mixed with traditional belief systems, and to have a couple with 2 different religions wasn't uncommon at the time. These early Christians would often have fewer grave goods or none at all, making it easy for modern archaeologists to distinguish between them. Another possibility is that the grave goods were stolen, though it seems unlikely that the robbers would have looted one grave and not the other. But the lack of grave goods was only the second most intriguing thing about this burial. The woman's facial bones were completely missing, as was the top of her skull. There seemed to be no explanation for why this was done. There were no other graves like this in the cemetery, and this practice wasn't something that the archaeologists had come across before. It's unlikely that this was the result of some kind of wound that had caused the woman's passing. In such cases, normally the bones are present but broken, rather than being completely removed. There was no evidence that the grave had previously been exhumed, but something may have accidentally disturbed the grave. The burial wasn't especially deep, and a plow might have caused the damage. Further research may uncover more information to solve this mystery, or simply to allow historians to learn more about this dynamic period of history. Number 6. The Iliad and the Odyssey are two of the best-known works of classical Greek literature. These epic poems were thousands of lines long, and each split into 24 books. But they only told part of a much larger legendary story of the Trojan War. Today we know the general outline of the rest of the story, but in ancient times, there were more epic poems that went into details about the other stages of the war. Today, they're completely lost. There is a lot that scholars aren't certain about when it comes to these poems, or the epic cycle. There are even questions surrounding the Iliad and the Odyssey. While these are both attributed to the poet Homer, it's possible that he was just a fictional character himself. The poems were originally told orally, and one version of this well-known but often shifting poem was likely written down for preservation. Historians believe this took place around 520 BC, when specific scenes from the Iliad and the Odyssey started to appear on pottery, and references were made in other pieces of work. For the other 6 poems that made up the epic cycle, it's even harder to say for certain when they were written. It was likely around the same time, though some believe they were composed and transcribed after the Homeric poems were already famous. Originally, the 8 poems weren't designed to go together. It would be something similar to 8 history books by different publishers that all focused on different parts of the Second World War, which were then packaged together after each had been published separately. By 240 BC, the 8 poems had been packaged together into the epic cycle to tell the entire story of the Trojan War. The narrative started with Cypria, which tells the story of the Apple of Discord, the kidnapping of Helen, and the start of the war. The Iliad came next, which follows Achilles' anger at Agamemnon, the loss of Patroclus, and Achilles' fight against Hector. The next book, Aethiopus, picked up after Hector's funeral and included the arrival and defeat of 2 Trojan allies, and then Achilles' own passing. The Little Iliad started with an argument over Achilles' armor and weapons and included the creation of the famous Trojan horse. The 5th book was Sack of Troy, which was literally the sack of the city. Homecoming dealt with how all the Greeks except Odysseus found their way home after the war. The Odyssey recounts the story of Odysseus' long journey home, and the final book, Telegony, tells the story of Odysseus' illegitimate son and Odysseus' eventual demise. Writers at the time were clear in their comparisons between the different works. The Iliad and the Odyssey stood out as being exceptional, while the others were likely too fast-paced and dealt with too many different storylines. When it came to spreading the poems of the epic cycle, the 2 more popular books were copied far more often. Unfortunately, that would eventually lead to the other 6 poems being lost to history. All we have today of these ancient poems are summaries that survive in other works, and a few references by writers during the Roman period. There's little chance that a long-lost copy of any of the poems may one day be found. It's possible that we might be able to add to the fragments we have, and it's likely that the papyrus they would have been written on has long since disintegrated. Number 5. In the early morning hours of April 15, 1912, the Titanic disappeared beneath the ocean. Just over 2 hours had passed since it had first sent a distress signal, and hundreds of passengers and crew members had looked out for help. The only help to arrive was the Carpathia, which arrived at 3:30 a.m. to pick up survivors out of the frozen lifeboats. Only 700 people survived the sinking. But as the lifeboats were being lowered hours earlier, passengers aboard the Titanic noticed another ship in the distance. The ship didn't come to aid, but seemed to be stationary and watching them. If this ship had come to aid them, it's possible many more lives would have survived the disaster. The Titanic Mystery ship has been an unsolved historical mystery since the ship first went down. During the initial investigation into the sinking, the SS Californian was determined to be the likely culprit. The Californian was a cargo ship that had been en route to Boston on the night of the disaster. Her path was slightly north of the Titanic's, and she was a little further west than the passenger ship. At 10:55 p.m. on April 14th, the wireless operator contacted the Titanic to inform them that the Californian was stopped and surrounded by ice. The Titanic's radio operator responded that he was busy working at Cape Race, a wireless station in Newfoundland. The wireless officer aboard the Californian went to bed, as did the captain, Stanley Lord. After the Titanic began to sink, the crew launched flares and rockets to try to attract attention, as well as issuing SOS messages via the wireless operator. The Californian didn't receive the messages, as the operator had signed off, but the crew did witness the rockets. The crew could visually see a ship they believed to be the Titanic, but there were no blinking signal lights. They used their own signal light to try to contact the ship in Morse code to see what was going on, but received no response. For unknown reasons, the crew aboard the Californian decided not to wake the captain or the radio operator. It wasn't until 5:30 a.m. that the Californian received the messages about the sinking, and by the time they arrived on the scene 3 hours later, there was nobody left to rescue. When investigators looked at the Californian's coordinates, they concluded that the ship must have been the one that was seen by the passengers aboard the Titanic. The Titanic had used signal lights to try to get help, but the mystery ship hadn't responded to them. It was theorized that the ships must have been too far apart to see each other's signal lights if the crew of the Californian were telling the truth. But that still didn't explain why they didn't go to investigate the rockets. But in 1985, the wreck of the Titanic was finally located, 13 miles east and south of the location where the Titanic had reported in its distress signals. It was determined that it was unlikely that the Californian would have been able to see the Titanic. There was another mystery ship that was apparently positioned between the two. A few other theories have been put forward as to the identity of the mysterious ship. One was the Samson, a Norwegian sealer, who was illegally operating in the area. The first officer told newspapers in Norway that they'd seen the distress signals from the Titanic, but as they were operating illegally, the captain didn't want to investigate. They didn't realize how serious the accident was until they arrived at port in May. Others have suggested it was a ship named Mount Temple, but like the Californian, it seems unlikely that this would have been in the vicinity at the time. The area where the Titanic sank was a busy shipping lane, and there were many ships that might have been in the vicinity. While some investigators keep digging to try to get an answer, it's possible that this mystery may be someday solved. Number 4. A village in Litcham in Norfolk, England, doesn't appear to be anything out of the ordinary. But the medieval church at the center of the village contains a secret that has baffled historians for centuries. Litcham had been populated since the Roman times, and the village appears in the Domesday Book, compiled in 1086. Despite its long history, there doesn't seem to be any event in the village that stands out as extraordinary. The village sits at a crossroads, with 5 country lanes passing through it. It's possible that rather being a significant setting for any major event, the players in those events would have passed through the village on their way to victory or defeat. Some may have stopped at the All Saints Church in the village on their way. When a church was first built on the site is unclear, but in 1379, a major restoration project began that lasted about 10 years. Most of the oldest parts of the church we see today date to this time, though parts such as the tower and the clock were built a few centuries later. 6 pillars stand in the nave of the church, and many have graffiti etched into them. The etchings come from various eras. Some are relatively recent, while others were carved back when the church was still new. Most are relatively small and simple, only lightly carved, but one stands out among the rest. In the central pillar on the south side of the church is the etching that has remained a mystery for hundreds of years. It's much deeper than the other graffiti, and the meaning is much less clear. Carved into the stone is what appears to be 2 words. The writing is in the style used between 1300 and 1500, but the letters are so close together that they blend into one another. It doesn't appear as if this was due to the amount of space, but a stylistic choice by the writer. Due to this, it's hard to make out exactly what the letters are, but it's usually interpreted as M. Wyke Bomberg. It's believed the work was etched before the first lime wash of the walls, and that dates to between 1412 and 1547. Historians initially believed the message, called the Litcham cryptogram, was written by a pilgrim, but later researchers aren't sure that's the case. If it was, there would be no reason to obscure the message in such a way. Above these letters, in much smaller letters, are the letters ASJMAY. Historians believe this stood for Save My Soul, Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. But this was likely carved much later, and possibly had nothing to do with the initial message. One theory is that the MM at the start of the inscription stood for Memento Mori, It might have been a way of honoring those who passed during the War of the Roses or during the Plague. Considering the time that has passed, it's likely this mystery will never be solved. Number 3. In 1720, pirate hunters in the Caribbean captured one of the most famous pirates of all time and his crew. The entire crew was sentenced to capital punishment, but 2 managed to delay the sentence. They were women and they were pregnant. One would pass away in prison, while the other would disappear from the historical record. Anne Bonny was more than capable of holding her own in Calico Jack Rackham's crew of pirates. Not much is known about her life before she turned to piracy, though in 1724, a short, mostly fictional biography was published about her. Anne was likely born around 1700, and according to legend, was the illegitimate daughter of a lawyer named William Cormac. When Cormac's infidelity was found out, he married Anne's mother, Mary Brennan, and the family moved from Ireland to Charlestown, Carolina. The legend states that Anne grew up disguised as a boy for much of her childhood, but would have to take over the running of her father's household when her mother passed away. She didn't get along with her father, especially when she married a man that he didn't approve of. James Bonny had married Anne to get access to her father's estate. When Cormac rejected him and kicked Anne out, the 2 left for Nassau, or New Providence Island. Anne mingled with the pirates and sailors at local bars, while her husband became a spy for the governor. This choice made Anne leave James and join the pirate crew of Jack Rackham. Anne once again disguised herself as a man, but she had a relationship with Rackham. At one point, the crew left her in Cuba so she could give birth on dry land. When Anne returned to the crew months later, there was a new sailor aboard. It wasn't long before Anne revealed herself as a woman to this new sailor and tried to seduce him. The new sailor revealed that they were actually also a woman in disguise. This was Mary Read, who was another fearsome female pirate. According to legend, her upbringing had been similar to Anne's. She had disguised herself as a man to fight in the British Army, but was later discharged. She became a pirate after the merchant ship she was traveling on was attacked, and she decided to switch sides. Anne and Mary became very close, to the point where Rackham was jealous of Mary before discovering she was also a woman. The 2 women were apparently the most fearsome of Rackham's crew. When pirate hunters found Rackham's ship anchored in the bay, they were the only ones to stay on deck to try to fight the boarding party. A broadside had been fired at the ship, and Rackham had sent the entire crew into the hold for their safety. Mary had declared them cowards, and someone sent a bullet through the deck of the ship into the hold, striking one of the pirates hiding there. No matter how fearsome they were, they couldn't fight the entire boarding party, and the entire crew was captured. They pleaded not guilty, but it took the jury no time to find them guilty of piracy. Mary and Anne both claimed to be pregnant and were sent to prison to await the birth of their children. Mary passed away due to illness behind bars, but no record of Anne's passing or release exists. Some believe she managed to escape prison, or her father may have even bribed authorities to have her released from prison. In 2020, a record for a woman named Anne Bonny showed she passed away in 1733. The location of her passing was the same parish where Mary's passing was recorded, but this was 23 years after she was first captured. Clearly, something abnormal happened here, but the end of Anne's life, much like the beginning of it, remains a mystery. Number 2. When archaeologists discovered King Tut's tomb in 1922, they were able to piece together parts of his life using the murals that covered the walls. An important person in his life was a woman named Enkesinamen. We actually know more about Enkesinamen's life than we do about Tut's, up until the point where he passed away. After that, there's much more mystery and unanswered questions. Enkesinamen was the daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. She was the 3rd of their 6 daughters and appeared in paintings and reliefs with the famous couple. Some historians believe she may have married to her father at one point, as Akhenaten tried to secure his dynasty with more heirs. They didn't have children though, and Enkesinamen was still young when her father passed. Enkesinamen married Tut around the time that he ascended to the throne. He was her half-brother, a practice that wasn't uncommon in ancient Egypt. The royal family wanted to protect their lineage and the divinity that they believed ran in their family. Unfortunately, this did lead to health problems, which was one of the reasons why Tut was so sick. Tut and Enkesinamen only ruled for about 10 years, and their most important acts were to revert the kingdom back to polytheism that ancient Egypt is known for. Judging by the reliefs found in Tut's tomb, Enkesinamen was a powerful influence in her husband's life. Some reliefs seem to depict the couple going about their everyday life, but modern scholars believe this showed Enkesenamen playing a role of a priest in various ceremonies. She was often seen preparing her husband in some way. In one image, etched onto the back of a golden throne, she wore a crown with cow horns and a sun disk, which might have been a reference to Hathor, the goddess associated with motherhood. The young couple seemed to have a rather loving relationship, and it doesn't appear as if this was simply a political marriage. But the couple would never produce any heirs, something else possibly caused by the complicated family tree the pharaohs had. When Tut passed away, Enkesenamen's life became more complicated. A ring located by archaeologists in 1931 indicated that she remarried to a man named Ai. Ai was one of Tut's advisors and took the throne after the boy king passed away. He may also have been Nefertiti's father. But there's another aspect to this period in her life. A letter was found addressed to the king of the Hittites from someone known only as the widow of an Egyptian pharaoh. The writer wants the Hittite king to send one of his sons to marry her and take the Egyptian throne. It was an odd request, as the two states were often at war, but the king sent his son Zenanza to Egypt. Zenanza disappeared on the journey, and most scholars believe he passed away. Whether that was through the actions of Egyptian attackers or by natural means is unknown. After this, Enkesenamen seems to have disappeared from the historical record. There was no mention of her in Ai's tomb, and she wasn't his main wife. Some believe that one of the mummies in tomb KV21 may belong to Enkesenamen. The remains are certainly of someone from the 18th dynasty, but other DNA interpretations suggest this might have been another Egyptian queen. Number 1. In 1593 England, the most famous playwright of the time was not William Shakespeare, but a man named Christopher Marlo. His plays were somewhat controversial, and some could see them as blasphemous and anti-authoritarian. But there was more to Marlo than most people knew, and that may be why he lost his life. Marlo had his life taken on May 30th, 1593. For centuries, rumors swirled about what had happened. As close to the official version of events that most people could get was that he'd been attacked in a bar brawl. In 1925, a researcher uncovered the coroner's report in the British National Archives. On the morning of the event, Marlo and 3 other men, described as gentlemen, visited a respectable house in Deptford, England. Rather than a bar, this was a private place where respectable men could meet, drink, and smoke. It was owned by Dame Eleanor Bull, who had some ties to the royal court. The 4 men spent the day in one of the rooms and in the garden. At around 6 p.m., the men had supper in the room. Marlo went to lie on the bed in the room, then began an argument with another one of the men, Ingram Fraser, about the bill. He stole a blade that Fraser kept on his person and attacked the other man. Fraser fought back and managed to take back his weapon before striking Marlo. The famous playwright was hit above the eye and passed away instantly. Fraser was found guilty of the crime, but was pardoned by the Queen after just 28 days in prison. Marlo was quickly buried in an unmarked grave, and the incident was put behind everyone involved. But many people don't buy the official story. The men Marlo spent his final day with weren't just gentlemen. All 3 were spies and had connections to the Elizabethan spy network. Marlo was also likely a spy. When he was studying at Cambridge in 1587, the college received a letter from the Privy Council stating that Marlo had been employed in matters touching the benefit of the country, which the college knew nothing about. As a writer, his patron was Thomas Walsingham, a cousin and a right-hand man of the man who created Queen Elizabeth's spy network. Walsingham was also Ingram Fraser's boss. Many have speculated that Marlo knew more than he should have and may have been about to reveal it. He'd recently been arrested for heresy, essentially being an atheist, which was a serious crime that could have led to a violent end. Marlo had been released on bail, but was due to face trial soon. Some feared that he may have been forced to reveal secrets as authorities tried to force a confession out of him. Marlo was aware of other atheists, including some of the Queen's Privy Council, and it would have been disastrous for this to come out. Others believed that this wasn't the style that the spy ring used to take out inconvenient people. Rather, given the drama of it all, they believed that Marlo faked his own passing. This theory suggests that he was trying to get out of the trial, and his spy ring connections helped him make his escape. It's also suggested that he had knowledge and connections that this ring wanted to protect, so helped him escape to the continent where he could live in exile. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.